Greetings to you from Australia. Thank you very much for this generous invitation for me to contribute to this important conference. Please allow me to begin my remarks with my sincere condolences and sympathies for the families of Mehdi Hassani and Behrouz Ehsani. Only 3 days back, on 27th of July 2025, these two political prisoners were executed in secret. They had been tortured, subjected to ill treatment, including beatings and prolonged solitary confinement, and there were threats to harm their families in order to extract forced confessions. They were subjected to completely unfair, arbitrary summary trial, which denied them access to a lawyer and were convicted by the notorious revolutionary court in Tehran. It was a barbaric political decision made by the regime to execute them, and the Iranian Supreme Court, unfortunately but unsurprisingly, turned down their appeals. I was shocked and heartbroken to see the video of Maryam Hassani confirming her father's execution. In addition, tragically, significant number of political prisoners are on death row and are facing imminent executions. Political prisoners are also being forcibly abducted and transferred to other prisons and are being increasingly subjected to torture and extremely inhumane prison conditions. Alongside these increasing executions, increasing amount of torture and repression and forced transfers, the brutal state machinery and its agents are also aggressively pointing out towards repeating the atrocity crimes committed by the very same regime committed during the 1988 massacre. On 7th of July 2025, Fast News, a state-affiliated outlet linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, published an editorial in which it praised the mass murder, summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions, as well as enforced disappearances of thousands of political prisoners in 1988, and termed it as a successful historical experience. The editorial, entitled Why the 1988 Executions Should Be Repeated, advocates and openly calls for a repeat of the 1988 massacre against current detainees, equating political dissent as a threat to national security and deserving of the execution in the style of 1988. The state-sponsored statements presents a dangerous prognosis of the regime's intention to repeat the atrocity crimes committed against the Iranian people in 1988. There are already real fears of mass executions amongst political prisoners, including Said Masuri, who has been in prison for 25 years without a single day of furlough and has now been forcibly abducted to a prison in Zahedan. Earlier, he had written a letter from the prison warning against the repetition of the 1988 massacre. He noted, and I quote him, he says, "This abduction under the pretext of transfer is not solely about me. It is fundamentally aiming at controlling, isolating, and silencing prisoners for further repression and insistence on more killings and executions, exactly like what happened in 1988. He added that he refused to comply with forced exile because he feels, and in his words, he says, a crime is in progress, and therefore it is necessary to prevent another silent and unreported massacre like in 1988. He says, let the world hear this time that a crime is happening, and of course, there is resistance against it. End of quotation. I must emphasize that the Iranian regime is and has been brutal and violent ever since its inception through the Iranian Revolution of 1979. This regime's systematic targeting of political prisoners is rooted in a culture of impunity, fueled by the failure of the international community to hold perpetrators accountable for past atrocities. The regime has weaponized the death penalty and mass executions as an instrument of repression, and fearful, they exterminate all those challenging the brutality of this regime. In July 2024, in my final detailed findings, I expressed alarm and shock at the summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions, the torture and ill treatment of tens of thousands of political opponents of the regime ever since the inception of the Islamic Republic in 1979. I documented the summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions of thousands of arbitrarily imprisoned political opponents, amounting to the crimes against humanity of murder and extermination, as well as genocide between 1979 and 1988. These executions included those of women, some of them reportedly raped before their executions, and a very large number of children. Highlighting the gravity of the crimes committed, I noted that atrocity crimes, in particular the 1988 massacre, represents the commission of the worst and most egregious human rights abuses of our living memory, whereby high-ranking state officials actively planned, ordered, and committed crimes against humanity and genocide. The findings of my report and my call for accountability and ending the impunity of the members of the regime has become even more relevant and urgent in recent days, when the regime is actively engaging in crimes against humanity through murder, extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions, torture of political prisoners. There must be global public condemnation and a show of anger and resentment by the international community, including by all member states of the United Nations and also by the United Nations mechanisms. In my 2024 report, I had urged the international community to establish an international investigative and accountability mechanism to ensure prompt, thorough, and transparent criminal investigations of inter alia, the atrocity crimes, of crimes against humanity and genocide that were committed against thousands of political opponents of the authorities in 1988. In particular, their mass murder through summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions, and imprisonments and torture, rape, and other sexual offenses and other inhumane acts, as well as the enforced disappearances. It is now all the more important and urgent that such an accountability mechanism is established. States must also use universal jurisdiction to investigate and to prosecute individuals for atrocity crimes committed during the 1980s, and in particular during the 1988 massacre, and through the ongoing crimes of inter alia and forced disappearances. The United Nations, as well as individual states, must take concrete steps to protect survivors, families of victims, and human rights defenders, both inside Iran as well as outside of the country. Finally, the United Nations General Assembly, in its annual resolution on Iran, should also include specific references to the 1988 massacre, as well as to the continuation of atrocity crimes, of crimes against humanity in the form of murder, torture, and enforced disappearances of political prisoners as being witnessed today. The international community failed to act in 1988. It must not fail again. The responsibility to prevent these atrocity crimes from being repeated rests with the United Nations and its member states. I thank you very much. Thank you.